My name is Joshua Waits. I'm the archivist here at Virginia Theological Seminary. I am here with Dean Ruthanna Hooke, who is here to give her oral history today. Thank you for being with me, Dean Hooke.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, my pleasure. So we're going to start with just some basic biographical information. So can you start by telling us your full name?
Ruthanna Brenton Hooke.
All right. And how do you prefer to be addressed?
Ruthanna's fine.
All right.
Yeah.
I always want to be respectful of
Sure.
doctor or dean or reverend. Would you please tell us your pronouns and how you identify?
So she, her pronouns identify as a woman, female, and lesbian.
All right. And when and where were you born?
I was born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1963.
All right. Would you mind sharing with us part of like your spiritual autobiography?
Sure. Okay. So I came from a family of, my parents were both seekers. I would describe them as seekers, very attuned to the spiritual world. My dad had been raised in a Unitarian family, and my mom raised in a Presbyterian family, although her mother's side was Quaker. When they met at a Quaker meeting. They both had gotten interested in Quakerism. But my mom had gone to Yale Divinity School back in the 1950s. She was one of the first women to go there. They had a quota in those days of 10 women per class, and she was one of the 10. In her particular class, she graduated in 56. And I graduated from there exactly 40 years later. So it was a really nice connection. But so she probably would have been ordained if she had the opportunity back in 56. She'd gotten very interested in the Episcopal Church while she was there, because Berkeley was already there and affiliated. And so when my parents met, they met at the Quaker meeting, but they also were attending an Episcopal church. And so my whole growing up was kind of between the Quakers and the Episcopalians. But both of my parents were just very, very interested in the spiritual world, the spiritual life. We spent a year in England when I was 10, 11, and that was really formative. They took my brother and me to visit all these cathedrals, and then these kind of like stone circles and sites out in the country where the pagan kind of sites, and like Stonehenge, those kinds of places. And I just got really, really taken with whatever it was that was going on in those places, that sort of sense of mystery. And we visited the Isle of Iona, where there's a community, my mom had always wanted to go there, so we went there. And that was really, really important to me. I went back there several times, as I would describe as an adult. So I just was always really interested in the spiritual path. Was, like I said, raised partly in Quaker meeting, partly in Episcopal church. When I went to college, I studied comparative religion. I was interested in Eastern religions, and I went to India and spent several months living there and kind of looked around at Buddhism and Hinduism and decided I was definitely a Christian. Like, I didn't feel drawn to those religions, but I was kind of fascinated. And then after I graduated, I spent some time traveling in Europe and visiting different intentional communities, of which the most important to me were the Iona community in Scotland and the Taizé community in France, both Christian communities. I visited some communities that weren't Christian too, but those two really drew me because I could see them joining together this really sort of spiritual, mystical side with a kind of real commitment to social activism and social change. And that's what I was really looking for. So those two communities really helped solidify me in a kind of Christian path. And then when I got home from that year of traveling, I started going to the Episcopal Church for real as a grown-up, and worked for a year in a kind of soup kitchen setting, and kind of like an Episcopal service corps sort of thing, but it was a Roman Catholic establishment in a city near where I grew up, which was in Western Massachusetts. And then I slowly, bit by bit, discerned this call to ordination. But at the time, I had been out since high school. Not out, but I had been very clear about my sexuality since high school. And so it seemed like it was going to be impossible to get ordained. That was the late 80s when I was starting to feel that call. I went and got a master's degree in performing arts and studied voice and embodiment, which you've experienced. And I then, so what happened was, I was in a diocese with a very conservative bishop. And the few people that I was out to at the time said, do not ever think of coming out to this bishop or you'll never get ordained. That was the way it was in the late 80s. So you really had to choose. I mean, I think like one openly gay person had been ordained, by that period. And there was a woman who I actually got to know, Elizabeth Carl, a real pioneer, was the first out lesbian that I know of to be ordained here in Washington. She was ordained. And I remember reading about that in the paper and being like, oh my gosh, it actually happened. But in my home diocese, there was just no possibility. So, but what happened then was that guy retired and a new bishop came in who was seemingly more open, but I was still closeted. So I got his permission to start at Divinity School. So I went to Yale Divinity School and was sort of affiliated with Berkeley, but Berkeley was run by Dean Philip Turner, who was very conservative and was known to be pretty anti-LGBT. So I really was closeted there. And that was quite painful because around me, a lot of my close friends were LGBT and they were out because they were in the UCC or they weren't pursuing ordination or whatever. But I was like, warning them, like, please don't tell anyone, I don't know, whatever. So then finally what happened was I had to go through the psychological exams, that you have to do. And one of the psychologists or psychiatrists, whatever, asked me absolutely point blank, are you a lesbian? And I remember saying, you're not supposed to ask that question. And then he said, but I need to ask that question because I need to know or something. And then I was totally sort of shocked and horrified. And I ended up telling him yes. And then I said, but please don't report that. And he said, no, I have to. That's what I'm doing. So he was horrible. That was just really bad. So then I knew that this was going into my record. So then I contacted this bishop, not the really conservative one, but the new one had come in. And I said, I need to talk to you right away. And I went and saw him. I said, this is going to come out and I want to tell you first. And he was totally great about it. This Bishop Bob Denning, he was this wonderful, wonderful guy. He came from this diocese from Virginia, from Holy Comforter in Vienna, came and was our bishop. Unfortunately, he died of bone cancer like a year later, like 2 years into his episcopacy, he died. It was awful. He was only like 48. But anyway, so he was really great and said, it's okay, we understand and you're fine and keep going. But then he died. And so that at that point I was out to him and to the commission of ministry, a standing committee, et cetera, in the diocese. But he died, and then they got a much more conservative bishop again, who Bishop Scruton, Gordon Scruton was his name. And so this is turning into this is not just the spiritual, this is the whole story. I don't know if I should stop and
keep going.
Okay, all right. So I could keep telling you because, yeah, there's more spiritual stuff about my life, but this turns into the sort of ordination story. So Bishop Scruton basically sort of put the brakes on my ordination, but said you can keep going to divinity school. I don't think I can ordain you because I don't ordain LGBT. This was like 94, 95. So we were still in the very early days of LGBT folks getting ordained. It wasn't happening very many places around the country, and certainly not in our diocese. But then he knew that I was a postulant because I'd already gotten that far before the other guy had died. So what he finally decided to do, which was really interesting, was he said, I can't ordain you, but I'm going to get another bishop to ordain you on my behalf. And this was like either his own ethical way of threading the needle, or he just didn't want to get in a lot of trouble with our diocese, which was a much more conservative place in those days. So he said, I'm not going to ordain you, but I'm going to get this other guy. And he got the retired Bishop of Connecticut to ordain me. And so the way it happened was this in spring of 98. I was ordained to the diaconate. I couldn't be ordained with the other deacons at our cathedral. I had to be ordained in my home parish, which was lovely because that was like a big love fest, by this bishop, retired bishop. So I had my own private little ordination over here. It was this, big occasion. And then 6 months later, I was ordained to the priesthood in Connecticut because I was working. At that point I was in a Ph.D. program at Yale, but I was working part-time as a clergy, part of this cluster where I basically preached and presided on weekends, but I didn't do much else. But they said, the bishop, my same conservative bishop, said you can't be ordained, or he worked this out with the current bishop of Connecticut, said we can't ordain you in a church in Connecticut, but we can ordain you at the seminary, at the YDS, at the Yale Divinity School, because it's it's not like technically. So there's this crazy loophole where, again, I was able to be ordained by this retired bishop in the Yale Divinity School chapel. So it was this kind of like never should have happened, but it kind of happened because there were all these weird little loopholes and ways that they tried to. Because I think the bottom line is he knew I was called. He could tell that. I'd already been approved, for the first stage. And yet he was really up against this diocese and also his own conservative beliefs. So he was wrestling with that paradox. So I got ordained in January of 99, which was amazing, and really did feel like kind of a miracle that it ever happened. And I thought there was actually going to be a protest at the first ordination, because I got this letter from priests in the Diocese of Western Massachusetts, like 2 weeks before the ordination, signed by a bunch of these priests saying, we know this is going to happen. We don't think you should get ordained, and we strongly object, which was horrible to get that. But they also, I think, said in the letter, we're not intending to come and protest. But all along till the very last minute, we weren't quite sure if it could be, that moment when, if anyone knows any reason why, blah, blah, blah. We wondered in both ordinations if that would happen, but it didn't. So then time goes by, so I'm increasingly out but not in the little churches where I worked, and not I then moved to a church where I was the assistant rector, which was also in Connecticut, kind of like just up the road. I wasn't out there. And what was interesting was that it really started to affect, I could tell how much it was affecting my ministry. Like there was this way in which those people really never got to know who I was. And the rector, who I was out to, could see that. And but what the problem was that, when I first got the job there at this church, I thought, well, I'm not going to come out now because I want them to get to know me. And then once they get to know me, I'll come out. But then there just never seemed to be like a good way to do it, or it would seem like more and more awkward. And so I never actually did come out. And then that was terrible because, like Judy, by that point, I was with Judy. She'd come and hear me preach and stuff. And of course, nobody knew who she was and why she was connected to me. And I think at the very, very end, I did come out, or it became very clear that Judy was my partner. And I think there was a sense of sort of betrayal on the part of the church, that I think they felt like I had been hiding something from them, which in a way I had, but as you know, it's so complicated because not coming out is not the same thing as lying. I mean, it's often self-preservation, or just like, how am I going to parse this so that I'm not seen as the lesbian priest coming in, so, but it was tough. And I'm going back, like way before I got ordained, I was an intern at a parish in Western Mass when the very conservative bishop at the beginning was still there. And I worked there for like 6 months with Alan Gates, who subsequently became the Bishop of Massachusetts, but he was like the rector of this little church at that point. And at the end of the time, we sat down and had breakfast one day, and he said, it's been great having you here, but there's a way in which we feel like we don't really know you. And I just started crying because I knew exactly what it was about. I mean, I was totally closeted in those days. And it was impossible for me to come out. That was in the era when it would have been the end right there. But I knew how much it was harming my ministry, being closeted. I could see that. So fast forward ahead to late 90s, early 2000s. I'm working in this church in Connecticut. I'm not out. I'm with Judy. Then I applied for this job here in 2000. I have a good friend who's a professor here. His name's Stephen Edmondson. He was the professor of church history before Hannah Mattis, along with Bob Pritchard. So anyway, and he encouraged me to apply. And he said, they've never had an LGBT faculty member, but, just do your best, be great, be fabulous, and they'll have to hire you, and we'll deal with it. And I think he sort of thought the institution would kind of be okay because they had gone through the change around the call to a holy life in the mid 90s, and Dean Horn was the dean, and so they'd gone through that whole process pertaining to students. So now you had students starting to appear, like this woman Eleanor, who maybe it was Eleanor Moore, but anyway, hope you'll get in touch with. She was a pioneer. But so there were a few out students at that point. And we didn't have apartments on campus at that time. Eleanor had a partner named Helen. I'm pretty sure she was in the Diocese of DC, which is one of the few dioceses that was ordaining LGBT at that point. And they lived off campus, and I'm not sure, I think they were, they couldn't get married in those days, couldn't get married. They were in this transition, essentially. The school was in this big transition that had been going on for several years under Dean Horn's leadership. So Stephen Edmondson, my friend, said, I think it'll be okay or whatever. And then I applied, got through the first round, came down, had the campus visit, got through the second round, and then in the spring of 2001, Dean Horn calls me up and she says, you are our top candidate. We would like to offer you the job. I have to ask you a question. I heard, my sources, that you're a lesbian and have a partner. Is that true? And I said, yes, it is true. And I'm planning to, if I were to come to VTS, I would come and move with my partner and we'd be there together. And she said, okay, that's the problem. And she said, you have to interview Dean Horn, by the way.
She has agreed to. Okay,
yeah, because she will tell this her own way. But my side of the story was, she said, you really should have told us in the interview process. And she said, I think your faculty members at Yale have given you bad advice to not come out. I think I might have said in the course of the phone call something about that, because I had my wonderful mentors at Yale who were sort of coaching me through this. But what I said to her then, and I really strongly believed, is that it wasn't like a pragmatic decision or like trying to sneak in by the back door. It was really a principled decision. Like, I don't think this should be an issue in my hiring. Like, I don't think I should raise and say, hey, just want you to know I'm a lesbian, I got a partner. Like, if they wanted to ask that question, they could ask it. They shouldn't, of course, ask the question. But it wasn't my job to come out and make it a problem on my part. And I just didn't think it should be a factor any more than anyone else's marital status or whether they had kids or any of the rest of it. A personal thing should matter. But she said, you don't understand this culture. This is a different culture from Connecticut, and we're really not as far along. And the fact that you didn't come out, didn't tell us about this during the interview process is going to strike a lot of faculty as you having deceived us in the process. And that you should have come out in the interview. Although at one point she said, if you had, you wouldn't have gotten the job. So she did admit that, but she felt as though I should have told her. Or at least I should have just told her, or if not, have come out to the whole faculty in the process. I just really felt like that was wrong. Like, that is not fair to ask me to do that and not right, because a person's marital status shouldn't affect things. But I think part of her thinking is we're not just a school, we're a community. You'd be living here with your partner. This is something that you needed to come clean about. So that became a kind of, so she said, okay, what I have to do is I have to bring this to the faculty, I have to tell them, and then we have to decide what we're going to do. And when she initially said that, she said, I'm not optimistic that they'll want to offer you the job at the end of this, even though she had said at the beginning of the phone call, we want to offer you the job. But once I came out to her, she's like, I'm not at all sure that we'll be able to accommodate this, because I don't know, I don't think the faculty's ready. I don't think the school's ready. You know, that famous, we're not ready, you know. So basically what happened was she then took the school through this 6-month, 8-month long process of discernment about this. So even though they had gone through the call to a holy life process, she said it's different when it comes to a faculty member, especially an ordained one, because you're an example to the student body. I mean, there's this language in the faculty handbook about being a wholesome example to the, you know. So for a lot of the faculty, this would be a very big leap from admitting students to having an actual ordained faculty member. So she said, we're going to have to go through a whole process. So, and I'm not optimistic. So meanwhile, I'm sitting up there in Connecticut, writing my dissertation and just kind of waiting. At the same time, I applied for another job at the Seminary of the Southwest. And that was interesting because once again, I got through the whole process. They wanted to offer me the job. I think if I'm remembering correctly, I came out in the course to the dean because I just didn't want to go through the whole thing again. And he said, well, we've never had an out-partnered faculty member here. I need to talk to my board, I need to talk to the bishop. And he came back to me and said, we really want to hire you. We want you to come, but the Diocese of Texas will not let you function as a priest here. So you wouldn't be able to, certainly not preside, and maybe not even preach, just sort of like basically giving up your ordination vows in order to come there. And I remember having a conversation with the bishop of Texas, whose name was Claude Payne, and he met me at the Church Pension Fund offices in New York. And he sat me down in this room, but to his credit, he met with me face to face. And he said, again, the Diocese of Texas is not ready. We've not been ordaining LGBT. We've not been letting gay lesbian priests come and serve in Texas at all. And you could come and work at the seminary, but you couldn't be a priest in the diocese. And that's just where we are right now. And he was clearly very pained. And I subsequently found out that he had a daughter who was a lesbian. Now, I don't know if this should maybe be off the record, but I think it's probably all such old news now. So that explains partly why it was obviously just so painful for him. But that was where his diocese was, and that was pretty much where he was. So I said, I can't do it. I mean, I can't take a job where I have to give up my ordination, essentially. Now, of course, it's really different in Texas, but This was in 2001 when it was not. So I'm waiting, wait. And then eventually in December of 2001, Martha Horn calls me back and she says, okay, we went through this whole process. We had forums, we had discussions, we had papers, we had this, that, and the other. And finally, we took a vote and only 4 faculty members voted against your coming. So we're ready to offer you the job and we would like you to come. So that was this huge watershed. And I said, okay, I'm gonna have to think about this, because by this point I was feeling a little bit disenchanted, And she's told me that, she said, the fact that you didn't come out in the process of the interviews did tell against you with some faculty, but eventually they realized that, there was a reason for it and you would never have gotten the job if you had. And so we put that aside and now we're just talking about, are we ready to hire an openly LGBT partner faculty member? She said, yes, we are. Only 4 people voted against you. So Judy and I came down the following January and we got like a little tour of the buildings and the houses and met with the student body president, whose name was Kedron Jarvis, I think. And she was interesting. She said, I really think we as a student body have moved on. We're going to be fine. This is not going to be a big deal at all. We're ready for LGBT faculty. We've had students. We're all cool. which turned out not to be true.
Right.
I mean, she was very sweet, and that's what she thought. But when chips were down, that wasn't true. So we hemmed and hawed, and we finally decided to come. We put it off for a year because of the I was trying to finish my dissertation, so we came in January of 2023. Is this taking too long?
No.
Gone.
I'm looking at how you're answering the questions.
Okay. All right. So I'll keep telling the story then. So we came in January of 2023. I happened to get, in those days they had a student paper, which I'm sure you probably found them. There were it was put into my mailbox, with everybody got them, right? So
Is this the Ecclesia?
I don't remember. Yeah, it might have been called that, or it may have had some different name, but it was like the student newspaper. Picked up my newspaper along with all my mail sitting there, and there were articles in it from students saying, "We're horrified that this lesbian faculty member is coming to VTS, and we just think it's wrong. And how are we going to, continue on in the Orthodox way with this person here?" And I read it. What is this? I was just horrified, and I suddenly the scales dropped from my eyes, and I thought, oh man, we are not in a friendly place.
Yeah. Blake Ryder talked about how after you came, there was a student body meeting that you and Martha Horn attended.
Yeah.
And he just, all he said is that the things that the students were saying to you were beyond horrible.
Yeah. Well, the one that I remember was, what happened was sort of a perfect storm in that Gene Robinson was consecrated that June of 2003. So I'd been here like 4 months, and then that happened. And so then all of the conflict blew up out to the open. And there was a group of students, very conservative students, who went to, it wasn't GAFCON, but it was like the precursor of ACNA and GAFCON.
The Communion Partners?
Yeah, and they went to this conference, and they came back and they were talking about it. I remember they were giving a presentation about their having gone in Scott Lounge, and then people like Blake Ryder and David Waycaster and others were kind of standing around like with their arms around each other in the back listening to this, because you could see that it was all very anti-LGBT. But the thing I remember was then we had this series of forums. I think this might have been what Blake's thinking of. And the first one was like Dr. Sonderegger and somebody else talking about scripture, and then there was something all that was abstract. And then the last one was me, Tim Sedgwick, who's the professor of ethics, as a kind of mediating, and then this student named Jay Morris, who was very, very conservative. And as I look back on it, and so this was like supposed to be this set of forums where we tried to talk about the gay issue and Gene Robinson and whatever. But this was the only one where they had like me actually up front. This was in the old days when what's now the Lenny Pate Room was an auditorium.
Right.
And the whole of the community turned out. So it wasn't just students, it was all the faculty and all the staff, because I was going to be there, and this whole thing had started to focus in on me. I look back and I think it wasn't fair of the conservative faculty who had voted against my coming to put this student up on the panel, because he's a student, so there was Tim Sedgwick, me, and then this student representing the conservative point of view. But none of the faculty who were on the conservative end wanted to be up there. So this student who was super against me and very conservative was up there. And that's where he said some things that were really quite hurtful about, like, I don't know, me being immoral, that I shouldn't be there, whatever. Tim Sedgwick was trying to be neutral, and I said, I wonder if this whole thing is somewhere. I think it was recorded that you might be able to listen to it, but it would be interesting because it was really a watershed moment. I sat there and I said, I'm not here to defend my sexuality. I'm not going to participate in being on trial here in front of you, but I'm going to talk about the cost of having to, be this sort of person who's kind of got this symbolic role of integrating the school, how much that how hard that is for me, how hard it is for my partner, etc. So it was so hard. It was like the hardest thing of almost that I've ever done. But afterwards, there was this real groundswell of support. I remember it especially from the staff, like the staff really kind of rallying around and saying, I understand something I didn't understand before, etc. And a lot of people who felt like this was wrong, like I should never have had to stand up there in front of the whole school and talk about, because I said, this is, this is not just, we're not just debating an abstract principle. We're talking about my life, my partner, my person I love, my identity. So it's personal. It can't just be this sort of academic discussion.
Right.
And that's where people were like, oh yeah, that must have been so hard. It was really, really hard. And it was in this whole phase when all of that conflict was coming out. And there were things that happened along the way that were interesting. One was there was a lesbian and gay student group, and it wasn't transgender or bisexual. In fact, I can remember talking to Martha Horn about it, and she said the board has more trouble with the whole bisexual idea because it, to them it equates to promiscuity, which is crazy. But anyway, so it was called the Lesbian and Gay Group. Where they had to meet. They met off campus. Like I can remember going down to a restaurant in Washington, D.C. and going into a back room, and that's where they all were. So we were meeting off campus. Sometimes they were meeting. A couple times we met in my house, but some people, wouldn't come because they would be like, I can't be seen. Knowing that this meeting was happening, they couldn't go into the room. So when I got here, there were a bunch of closeted students, and they would come talk to me and I'd say, I'm struggling with this because I can't be out in my diocese, and how do I negotiate this? And so I had this little cottage ministry, which was ministering to all these students who were closeted back then. So that was one of the things I remember. I remember a student who was straight, who was in a class with me, and toward the end of it was like, he was from West Virginia, rural West Virginia. And he said, you are not what I expected from a lesbian. I just never met, which of course wasn't true. He just didn't know that he met. But he said, now I know, and my mind has changed. So that sort of happened. There were people who would come up to me and say, like, you're not what I expected, and it's just, whatever. My mind is changing. But then there were times when there were people who wouldn't receive communion from me, which was so hard. Like they would sit in the pew and not come up, or they would leave when it was time for communion. It was just, like really, some really painful stuff that happened. And the other thing, backing up a little bit, was that when I got offered the job, Peter Lee, who was the bishop at the time, said that I couldn't serve as a priest in the Diocese of Virginia because, again, they weren't ordaining LGBT, they weren't letting them serve. But it wasn't as bad a problem as in Texas because I could just go across the river and work in DC. So I thought, okay. And he said you can preach and preside here on campus, but you can't work in any churches in Virginia. So we went and we became part of St. Thomas's downtown, and so there were these things. And interestingly, when I started doing Deep Calls to Deep, there was a priest in that first program, I think it was the first one, who came up to me and said that in the Diocese of Virginia, right after I was hired, there was this huge blow up, and she remembered the priests in the diocese or at the convention or something talking about the fact that I was coming and this whole brouhaha. It would be interesting to kind of like go a little further afield and see if you could figure out who would have been there in 2000, 2001, or 2002.
And this was at the diocesan convention?
I believe it was either that or a clergy conference, but she said there was this huge uproar. Oh, wow. And she herself remembers having to stand up for, my coming or whatever.
Do you mind if I ask you a few follow-up questions?
Sure, go ahead.
I mean, you've described so many painful things.
Yeah.
once the position was offered to you,
Yeah.
were you treated differently by the 4 faculty?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So of course I was trying to figure out who they were, and I wasn't told, but it was pretty clear who they were. So when we got here, there was this really lovely outpouring of welcome mostly from the faculty, like people bringing us food and people, sending us things. And some of the folks who came, I knew were among the 4 who had not wanted me to be here. And they were polite. They were always polite. The 4 of them that I sort of pretty much who I know to have been those 4. But what was interesting was that they had a practice of when they were reading out in faculty meetings, they're reading out the names of the people who should be ordained, and we have to vote to approve all our students for ordination, and a couple of them would always vote no or abstain from anyone they knew was LGBT, and they were continuing to do that when I was first there. So the first several years, they would raise their hand and abstain. And then finally, I think it just got so uncomfortable for them because I was sitting there in the room and they stopped doing it. But one of them, I don't know I'm sure you could find out, Rich Jones, who's a lovely guy, decided he was just going to abstain on everybody because he sort of felt like we don't have good rules about what counts as sexually acceptable behavior. It's all very muddy and unclear, so I'm just going to abstain on everyone. And I'm not sure if Bob Pritchard did the same thing. I'm trying to remember if the 2 of them did, but at least one of them. But they decided they were just going to abstain on everyone, partly, I think, because abstaining on the LGBT was so awkward with me sitting there, but it was also really awkward for me. So they were 2 of the 4, and they were, and to their credit, they received communion from me. They were, always very respectful. They didn't kind of do anything dramatic, but they were trying to continue to hold to what they felt was right, even though I was here, and they were also trying to be very nice to me. So it was clearly very awkward on both sides.
I know I read something in one of the many articles that the faculty had written, not about you, but just about, this was about.
Was that about the call to life in general?
You're right.
Yeah.
And there's one phrase I remember from Dr. Jones, who I've met. He came and he worked on his papers, and you're right, he's a perfectly charming man.
Yeah.
And it was a very, for a person who conservative theologically conservative on this issue, I thought it was a lovely statement that he put in one of his things, in which he said, if I'm quoting him correctly, something to the effect of, I wait optimistically to be convinced.
And
so that even though he clearly did not hold, his theology clearly would not let him go that way, that he could give at least that much grace. But I wait to be
right.
And the optimistic part.
Yeah, that's very sweet. And this wonderful thing happened when on one of our quiet days, I think it was the first or second year I was here, you had the quiet lunch and people were sitting, and I was sitting at a table having my quiet lunch, and he came and sat down opposite me to have his lunch. And we both sat there in silence and had lunch. And it was just this wonderful way of kind of him sort of reaching out and trying to kind of make a connection, even though we couldn't talk, which was probably good because we wouldn't have necessarily agreed, but just the fact that he came and sat down across from me and we had lunch. So there were lots of things like that kind of bridged, the gap, and with those 4 faculty members that made it easier. And I never felt they were out to get me or that there was any personal vendetta. And I felt like they were kind of pained, by what they felt was the contradiction between their principles and the fact that I was here and that I seemed like a perfectly nice person. And so,
which is always that is the journey.
Yeah, that is the journey. That's
when you're forced to come in contact with someone who identifies
Yeah.
as LGBT.
Yeah.
You,
And it
you,
doesn't
you,
fit your-
it
yeah.
does, you're forced to go, I'm principled on
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
Yet this person is here. I
Yeah.
can't deny that this person is here.
Right.
And yet this person doesn't match what these principles I hold.
Yes. Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
And how do I be faithful to what I truly
Yeah.
believe, and yet also extend
Yeah.
respect and love and dignity to this
Mhm.
person who deserves it clearly.
Yeah.
But that's part of the journey. And some people, I think those are, I think that's why, Harvey Milk always told everyone to come out,
Yeah.
so that would be the force
Mhm.
on people.
Yeah.
Was Bill Stafford still academic dean when you came?
Yes.
So the reason why I ask is because I talked to Martha Horn, and
Mhm.
she told me that he was not in favor of changing the policy,
Right.
but that through conversations between her and him, he agreed to stay.
Yeah.
And I've talked to other students, like, what was it like to interact with him?
Yeah.
Because not only is here a professor, here's the academic dean.
Right.
So this is a man with power.
Yeah. Yeah.
Who also holds a different
Right.
theology than
Yeah.
what the seminary has approved.
Right.
And Martha Horn has told me, she says, I can get him to agree to be interviewed as well.
Yeah. Okay, that would be interesting.
Right.
That would be an interesting one.
What was your interactions with him? Because from what students told me, that it was the same experience, that he was perfectly fair
Yeah.
and kind.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that your experience of
Yeah,
him as well?
definitely. That was my experience. And I can remember a conversation where he was pretty straightforward, more so than Rich Jones or Bob Pritchard or the others that I thought had voted. Where he basically, because he knew that being the academic dean, he was kind of my supervisor, immediate supervisor. And he said, basically, I know that we disagree about this. I'm still very glad that you're here. And I just hope that you can respect my position and I'll respect your position. And I said, fine. So that was, we just sort of got that out of the way at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, he was fine. I mean, he was clearly also very pained by the direction the school was taking, but he was very fair to me. There's never any question about that. The other interesting thing in those early years was that when, so you're probably familiar with this, but there was a period there at the beginning where I felt like whatever I did, it was like the lesbian doing that. Like, this is the lesbian teaching this class, or the lesbian preaching, or that was the first thing that came into people's head when I walked into a room.
Mm-hmm.
And that was just a drag because I felt like they couldn't see anything else that I was doing.
Right.
But one of the overlaps that was very tricky was teaching the voice and embodiment stuff, which was has always been really important to me, because to some people it felt like, oh, this is this weird teaching style that she's bringing here because she's a lesbian. Like it sort of overlapped with, you're going to tell us to be in our bodies, you're going to ask us to breathe, you're going to ask us to lie down on the floor, you're going to, everything became a little bit, suspect,
Right.
and possibly sort of sexualized because of being a lesbian, even though the work is not that really, but it was embodiment. So there was a sort of a pall cast on some of that early on that made it really hard for me to. And there was one student who kind of complained and said, she's making us do weird things that are, sexual or whatever, which really wasn't true. And she complained actually to Bob Pritchard, and then he took it to Martha Horn. And I was really scared because I thought this is going to be like a sexual misconduct complaint or whatever. And I went and talked to Martha, and she was like, no, don't worry about it. It's totally fine. The other thing, you really should talk to her, because she got such a backlash. Oh my gosh. Around the call to holy life stuff. And then my coming, huge, and hundreds of letters and hate mail and stuff, which she didn't tell me about, because I think she felt like, I was living my life and also had enough difficulty to cope with on my own. But I think it was quite difficult for her. That she encountered a lot of backlash. And I will say this about that whole process of my being hired, that was sort of a classic Martha Ward process with a very long process. So whereas Dean Markham will sort of like say, we're going to do this, and he'll just make a decision, she would take a much longer time, with a much longer process. But by the end of it, she pretty much waited everybody out and got most everyone on board. So it worked, but it was definitely a long drawn out.
Well, I've read not concerning you, but about the Call to a Holy Life. I've read some of the letters that were sent, and they're difficult to read.
Yeah.
Really. So because they're those are those things that I go, okay, I limit myself to 2 letters a day.
Yeah, that's scary. Yeah.
Speaking of your classes, I understand that the setup at the time when you came was that pretty much until you're like the last semester of your middle year, VTS told you what you were taking.
It was more of a set. It was just changing when I got here. Set curriculum. Yeah.
And that the main thing was the homiletics classes.
Yeah.
You were required to take one with one professor and one with the other.
Sure. Yeah.
And that the conservative students complained. And what I was told was that they were given the accommodation that they didn't have to take your classes.
Yeah, I think that might have been true. Now, see, okay, so there was another professor here, Judith McDaniel. She was much more conservative in her theology and also in her teaching than I was. And it was like oil and water. I mean, it was not, one year we tried to see if we could co-teach the way Mark and I have done and the way I've done since she retired, Judith McDaniel. It just didn't work at all because our approaches were so different. We couldn't even come up with a syllabus. So so we had this method where she would have a semester with students and then I would take the final quarter. It was like a required sequence, more like the way Bible is now or whatever. And then, so I would get her students for the third quarter, and then I would do my students for a semester and she would get my students for the third quarter. And nobody ever straightforwardly said to me, but I did start to notice that it seemed like there were certain students who didn't ever switch into my class, you know. So yeah, that is a little bit troubling to me because I don't know if I ever really knew that. I mean, I sort of suspected it, but
it wasn't like Dean Stratford or Dean Horn sent you a memo saying these students are allowed to
not be in my class. No, that didn't happen. So I think they were, I mean, on the positive side, I think you could say they wanted to spare me the pain of knowing it. But on the negative side, like if you think about it, and it's not huge groups of people, you can kind of see that there are certain students that never take a class with me. So, and there were a few that I remember who seemed to be there just on sufferance, like they were, and in course evaluations, they would say something like, well, I didn't want to be in Dr. Hooke's class, but it wasn't as bad as I thought it would be, or, you know, something like that. Like they really were suspicious of me as a teacher. On the flip side, there were a lot of students who were really, really happy to take classes with me because Dr. McDaniel's approach was very, very restrictive. She had one method that she always taught, and for some students, it was just really not what they wanted to do. So it sort of balanced itself out. But then the other thing that happened was that after Gene Robinson and after I got here and then Gene Robinson happened, you know, there was really sort of a schism in the Episcopal Church and ACNA started. And there were a lot of bishops who just stopped sending students here. And some of those letters to Dean Horn were probably from bishops saying, I'm never going to send another student here. And so like that student, Jay Morris, who was so conservative, there weren't a huge number more students like that after I got here, because there was a sort of self-selecting process, and a lot of those students just started going somewhere else. So now, if you think about how much BTS has changed, it's turned into a much more progressive place.
And do you think that shift was due to of students going to other seminaries, do you think that was due to you coming, or more towards like Gene Robinson and the Acts of General Convention
And
and ACNA and the split?
well, I think there's probably a lot. I think there were probably bishops who were already not going to send people here once the call to a holy life got changed, like in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
There was another group that decamped after I got here, and then once the split kind of happened, that was yet another sort of nail in the coffin for some of those people. So it was just a progression of events that led to conservative dioceses just dropping away, and they would go to Sewanee, I guess, or they go to Shota House or Trinity or somewhere else, but not here anymore. I think what happened was, I think that Martha Horn determined that VTS had to move more toward the middle or center or left in order to keep up with, where the Episcopal Church was moving, where the culture was moving. And so from being a fairly conservative school in the early 90s, it shifted more toward the center and then more toward the left as in these 25 years since I've got, I've been here 20 years, but whereas other schools sort of took up more of the sort of conservative benefits. That's my interpretation, but it was not just me. It was a lot of different steps that led to that, I think.
Yeah, and then that's been described by others that that there was this move to become more of the big tent school.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So when you moved here, and Judy came with you, were you allowed to live in faculty housing? Or?
Yeah.
So they didn't do this, so you have to be off campus.
Right.
So you were given a house here on campus.
Yeah, that same one we still live in.
Mm-hmm. We've talked about faculty a lot.
Yeah.
But a lot of what we've talked about has been, your struggle to wanting to become faculty, and then those who resisted you being added. Were there any particular people that you would describe as your, safe places, your allies?
Yeah. Interesting. I mean, I always felt like Martha Horn was an ally. So even though when I applied and then she told me you should have come out earlier and this is a problem and all that, she was really a very strong ally. And I felt she wanted all along, she wanted to hire me. She wanted that change to happen. And she was just going to figure out how to make it happen. So once I got here, I felt like she was someone I could really trust. Another one was Mary Hicks, who was the CFO. She was always very welcoming and very reassuring. I had my friend Stephen Edmondson, who, was the one who initially told me that I should apply. And he was very much an ally. Dr. Sonderegger was an ally. She got here right before I did. And she was somebody who I talked to a fair amount in those early days when things were really difficult. And I'm trying to think who else back in those days. Dr. Fentress Williams was here, and she I had known from Yale Divinity School, so she was an ally, a friend. And then we spent more time off campus, like we were at St. Thomas's. We had a strong connection down there. Got to know people like Elizabeth Carl, who, as I said, was the first lesbian to be ordained. Carlisle Gill, who was she's another one you should interview. She is an alum from here, from the, I don't know, maybe the 80s or something. And she, I can remember her when I was sitting in the refectory my first spring. She was a priest in the area, and she came rushing over, gave me her card, and said, "Get in touch. We're so glad you're here." And that happened to me a certain amount in those early months. That people would come out of the woodwork like that and be friendly and just welcoming and saying it's important that you're here and we're glad you're here. All that. Our alums. Yeah.
So you, when you first got here, any type of LGBT support was meeting off campus, really?
So those people, largely. I mean, there were a few people, like David Waycaster comes to mind because he was out. This woman, Eleanor, although I think she graduated, there might have been a couple other students who were out, but it was definitely like a really small minority. And then there was this whole underground community of closeted students.
And was it that way until, because after you came up, the next out person was Bill, correct?
I think was it Bill Roberts or was it Lisa Kimball? It was one of the two, but it was several years later. It probably was Bill Roberts. I can't remember the chronology.
Because the way a lot of the students describe it is the LG, the forming groups, the way they ended up starting meeting on campus was Bill Roberts' house.
Yeah.
He opened his house up.
Yeah.
For some of them to have cookouts and things.
Right.
So you've been here when, only one or two students are out. And are meeting off campus. And there is this, veil of secrecy.
Right.
To, now we have budgeted. Prism's budget got a budget to operate and things. Are there any particular moments since you've been here that are like watershed moments of progress at VTS?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've been meaning to mention, which really was huge for us, was when Silas was born. So when I got pregnant, which was in the summer of 2005, so I've been here 2.5 years. It was just really mind-boggling to people. Like, how can she be lesbian and be pregnant? I mean, there were people who just never had seen LGBT parents. So it got weirder and weirder for them. Like, I was pregnant, I would be celebrating at the altar, and like, this is just, this doesn't compute. We can't figure this out. So that was actually quite difficult, the pregnancy and being here and people not being able to fathom how it was that I was having a child. But then when he was born, there was this huge outpouring again of like meals and gifts and presents and like just all this wonderful love. I mean, really, we didn't cook anything for like at least a month, and all these presents kept coming. And then, of course, Silas was just this very normalizing presence, because he was a baby like any other baby and had all the baby things going on, the challenges and the joys and that just, a lot of people came around. It was really interesting. Like, that was a turning point for our sense of feeling included in the community, especially Judy, I think, because Judy had been, and she's another one that you could interview. I think she had felt very, very wary at first and very like on her best behavior all the time and really keeping a low profile and not at all sure that this was a good place to be and whatnot. And then after Silas was born and there was that whole outpouring, it really changed her mind about living here and made her feel much more at home and like she could trust this community. And I felt like that too. And even among the, the 4 faculty who I felt probably had voted against me, there was they all were part of that whole outpouring. And that was just really, really lovely. I remember when I was pregnant, talking in my formation group, somehow I didn't tend to like bare my soul in the formation groups because I felt like that's up to the students, but somehow something happened where somebody asked me, I think point blank, about being pregnant and having a child in this environment as a lesbian, like, how would that be? And I remember saying I felt very worried about how this child would be accepted, whether this child would be accepted in this community, and whether we'd be accepted as parents and all that. And I particularly remember one of the students in that group volunteering to be a babysitter for Silas. And his name was Goose Powell. And that was not his first name was Laurel. Goose, he went by Goose. And he was just the sweetest guy. And he really was. I was his babysitter for the last couple of years that he was there. But I found out that he had done that as a sort of statement of principle, as like a way of saying, I'm going to participate in welcoming this child and making this child feel like this is his home. And then we had this whole coterie of student babysitters, because in those days, the Butterfly House didn't take you until you were 2 years old. So for the first 2 years, we had this like rotating group of babysitters who were these wonderful, wonderful students, really great. And many of them I still sort of keep in touch with, one or the other. And I think not only Goose, but some of the others might have done it for that reason, like to just sort of say, this is our child, this is a part of the community. And so that was this really, really big turning point for us personally. And I think for the school, in the sense that somehow being parents was just a very sort of ordinary thing. And that made a lot of people see that I was just an ordinary person. So that was one turning point. I'm trying to think of another one. Some of, all the sort of schism and split and stuff like that with ACNA that was happening from 2003 to, 2007, 2008, shifted the demographics of the school and who came. And so by 2008, 2009, 2010, it just felt like a different place. Having Bill Roberts come and Lisa Kimball, that was enormous for me to not be the only one. And it's true. I mean, I remember having the students over a couple times to my house, but part of the reason we didn't do more of that was because we had Silas, and so our house was chaos and all this. And David and Bill were just seemed better set up for it. So yeah, they started having gatherings and people started coming. And I can remember conversations in those gatherings, people saying like, I'm not out, but so please don't talk about it. And then like maybe 3 or 4 years later, even everyone in the room was out and they were saying, do we still need to have a group, or should this group consist of LGBT and their allies, or do we still need like a little group where it's just us? And so that just speaks to the level of change that was happening. Another watershed, but I can't, was the first trans person, which was pretty recent. I mean, I think Logan might have been the first one.
Right.
But that was I remember talking to some people saying, when is that going to happen? It's going to be soon. And then he shows up. So
right.
Yeah.
Do you still feel like the lesbian professor?
No, I don't. I mean, I really don't feel like that's what people are thinking of anymore when they think of me and my teaching and so forth. I mean, it could be wrong, but that's just, and it's one of those things where it just sort of slowly changed. So I couldn't even pinpoint the moment at which it felt like it really shifted. But so there wasn't like one moment when suddenly it was no longer an issue. It just kind of ebbed away,
So would you say VTS is now an inclusive place?
I think as far as LGBT, it really is. And one of the things that I think is so strange is that the place has changed so dramatically in terms of inclusion around LGBTQ+. But I don't think, but we have so much further to go when it comes to race and even gender and class. Like those are issues where I feel like we're not as far along at all.
Right.
So that's interesting to me. So I think it's more inclusive in terms of sexual orientation and even transgender identity than it is in regard to some of those other things.
Is there anything else you would like to share?
No, I'm trying to think. So, one of the things I remember, when in that preaching class, we have people do the cultural particularity matrix where you talk about race, class, gender, sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is still the one that people find the hardest to answer. If they are not LGBT, they'll say, well, I'm heterosexual. I don't think that affects my reading of this scripture at all. So it's sort of like people, it's still a little bit, yeah, like if you're heterosexual, somehow to reflect on that identity is harder for people.
Right.
I mean, some people can't answer the question when it comes to being white. How does my being white affect my reading of the passage? Some people can't figure that out, but more with the sexual orientation. But I can also remember when we first did that assignment, which was probably around 2011 or 2012, there were people who just, and I would say this, I said, if any of these questions would make you uncomfortable to answer because it would, I don't know, compromise something that you need to not reveal, then don't. And there were people who wouldn't answer the question about sexual orientation because in those days it were still closeted. But now it's like hard to even think of a diocese where that's the case. Because I feel like if you're in that diocese, there's not that many of them, you would just go somewhere else because it wouldn't be worth fighting that battle. But that could just be me not knowing. But it seems like we get LGBT students from all over the country now. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else I could share. One of the things that has felt like a huge barrier to me is ever talking about my orientation in a sermon. So even though like heterosexual preachers will talk about their wife, their husband, or the kids, whatever, I always felt like I couldn't do that. And I think the first time I ever did, it was several years after I'd been here. And it was only in the course of like, oh, my partner and I went to the movies or something, like, and I think maybe even more time went by before I actually talked about it in a kind of like the content of the sermon was about my sexuality and the journey that I've been on. So that has almost felt like the last bastion of, you can't talk about it because it's going to feel to people like you're rubbing their noses in it, and they don't want to. Right. Which is so unfair because again, straight people will talk about their families all the time, and nobody thinks anything of it.
But you still feel that way?
No, I don't so much. I'm just saying that I think it took a much longer time to get over that hurdle and to feel like it's okay to talk about this, and people are not going to think I'm trying to make a point or I have an agenda, or this is really just me talking about my life and how I approach things because, this is part of my story, not because I'm trying to make a point or, something like that. So.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story.
Sure. You're welcome. Yeah. I have no idea what time it is. Oh, it's just about